One of the best ways to save money gardening that's also very easy to do is to make your own compost. I'm Lisha. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that in this video. Now, one of the things you really need to know about compost is it's not a fertilizer substitute. It has a minimal amount of nutrients in it, so that nutrients is absorbed very quickly by the plants, and it's also leached out to things like rain and snow. So you still need to be adding fertilizer to your soil even when you add compost. The real reason you want to add compost to your soil is it's a soil conditioner, which means it improves your soil. Things like tilt, which is the physical condition of the soil, it improves your aeration, which reduces compaction, and then that helps with your root growth. It also helps with water penetration and your water holding capacity. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to show you how these things break down, and then I'm going to show you how to actually make your compost pile. What breaks down your compost pile are microorganisms, and these are what generate the heat that are going to help break down your pile, and they help create the carbon that you're going to use for energy and the nitrogen that your garden is going to use for growth. Now, bacteria is the first one I'm going to talk about. It is what breaks down your soft green materials, and those are what are higher in nitrogen, and your bacteria is actually going to break down about 80 to 90% of your compost. The other organisms are fungi, and they're best at breaking down the materials that are high in carbon. Those are your brown materials. Fungi break those materials down, and then that enables your bacteria to finish the decomposition process. And then they are also assisted by your larger organisms such as earthworms, slugs, and millipedes. Your nitrogen sources, which are your green materials, can be from coffee grounds, tea leaves. If you're going to compost tea bags, you want to use some discretion because some of those can contain plastics, fruit and vegetable scraps, grass clippings, as long as they are untreated. You do want to dry those in a thin layer before putting them in there, unless you're kind of throwing them in as clippings from when you pick up your leaves with a mulching mower, which is what I do, because it mixes that green and brown material together and it helps my compost piles break down a lot faster. You can also use eggshells, but the thing about eggshells is they are neither green nor brown materials. They're actually pure calcium, and it does take them years to break down if you do not crush them up or turn them into a powder. I actually use let me grab it. I use my blender to break these down so that they break down a lot faster, and it turns them into this really fine, broken down kind of powder. And then I also take this in spring and I will mix it into my containers. Calcium is important in your garden because it helps prevent blossom end rot, which is when the end of your vegetables, the flower will actually kind of wilt and the end turns like a mushy brown color, and it eventually just rots your entire vegetables. And this is the most common in your nightshade vegetables, which are things like your tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants. But it does occur in any vegetable, so you really want to make sure you do have enough calcium. And when it comes to blossom end rot, it's typically not a calcium deficiency in your soil. It's caused by watering your plants erratically. So when you allow your soil to dry out completely, that is typically what is causing your blossom end rot, because the soil is dry, so your plant is unable to suck up water into the vascular system, and that means it can't absorb the calcium. And once that happens, all of your stuff is going to start rotting. Now, things you do not want to compost are your disease materials, which is why I don't compost anything if I don't know the source. That means any store-bought fruits and vegetables, or even things that come from your local farmers markets, because you don't know the source. And chances are, because especially commercially produced fruits and vegetables are produced on a massive scale, I'd bet almost 100% of the time those plants are going to be diseased. And compost piles do not break down the majority of your diseases. They just don't get hot enough. The other thing, I know animal products, which means dairy, meat products, bones, things like that, because they can create a bacteria in your compost pile that can kind of wreak havoc on your compost pile and your garden. You don't want to put any pet feces in there because it's the same thing. Those carry bacteria that just aren't good for your garden or your compost. You never want to add lime because it causes a chemical reaction that releases nitrogen gas in the form of ammonia. And that is not something you want to have happening. If you're using kitchen scraps, you do want to add some dry, high carbon materials to reduce the odors and aid in decomposition, because you do need a mix of roughly 30% green and 70% brown, or 40% green and 60% brown, so that you have the right material mix in there to break down your pile properly. I don't really worry too much about this. As long as I am mixing in a combination of both and less green than brown, I really don't have any kind of a problem with my compost pile breaking down or any kind of smells. There are actually two main types of compost piles, which are cool and hot. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what those are. One of the main types of composting piles is your cool or passive composting, and that's carried out by a very narrow range of microorganisms. It takes it about a year, and you want to turn that pile 1 to 2 times a year. When you add fresh materials to this, you're going to remove that top layer of materials, and you're going to harvest your compost from the bottom. Now, when you are filling this, you do not want it taller than 5 feet, because if you do that, it compresses your pile, which compacts your organic waste, and that's going to limit air movement. And when that happens, it creates anaerobic decomposition, which means there is no air in there and nothing's going to break down right, and you're going to end up with a very smelly pile. Now, your other one is called an active or hot composting, and that gets filled all at one time. Most people usually fill that one in the fall when there's a whole lot of brown and green materials around. You want a bin size with that one with a minimum of 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, and it's going to produce your compost in about 6 to 8 weeks. It does have the biggest, widest range of microorganisms that generate your heat, and you want to turn it before your temperature drops below 100 degrees. You don't add any more materials once your compost pile is breaking down, unless you start to have issues where it's not breaking down, or you do start to have a smelly kind of compost. That means that your compost doesn't have either enough green materials or enough brown materials, so you kind of got to figure out which is which and then add a little bit more. Typically it's not enough brown materials, so you're going to want to add that in. Once your volume of your compost pile breaks down by about 50%, temperatures aren't going to rise anymore. So what's going to happen is you're going to start a curing process, which takes about 2 weeks. And the reason you do that is because it helps to stabilize your compost pile. And then your compost is going to be ready when it has a earthy smell, which if you've ever walked through a forest and you kind of have that smell that permeates the air, that is an earthy smell. The carbon sources for your compost pile are the brown materials, and these are things like your shredded dry leaves. You need to shred them because if you leave these whole, the wind is going to blow them all over the place, and so when you shred them, it actually allows them to compact so that that doesn't happen. You can use pine needles, despite what people say. It's a very popular myth that you can't put pine or anything coniferous in your compost piles, and it's actually not true. They are acidic, but when they're in the compost pile, they are broken down, and when that happens, that acidity ends up being neutralized, so it really does not affect your compost pile. You can actually use those materials as mulch in your garden too, because it's the same process. It does not affect your pH. You can also use things like cardboard. You just want to shred it first. You can use newspaper, same thing. You want to shred it. Paper bags, cardboard tubes that come from toilet paper and paper towels. Those are all really good things that you can put in your compost pile. It's okay to use those brown materials because they're not bleached like white paper is. So you're really not going to run into the chemicals that you'll find in your white paper. One of the first things when it comes to where you want to locate your compost pile, full sun is the best because your heat does help break down that pile a lot faster. But if your only spot is in the shade, that's perfectly fine because it is still going to break down. Rain, snow, the microorganisms, the larger organisms, they're all going to help break that down. You do want to break up any large materials that you use, cut them up, make them a little bit smaller to help them break down a little faster. If you don't want to do that, that's perfectly fine too. You can just throw the stuff in there. It just takes it a little bit longer to break down. When it comes to dry weather, you want to cover your compost pile to help it retain moisture, because if it dries out completely, all of those organisms that are in there are going to end up being no more. You also want to protect it from becoming overly wet, because if it becomes too wet, it's also not going to break down properly, and that's where you're going to end up with that kind of smelly compost pile. In the north, that tends to be in the fall and in late winter, early spring. If you're making the cool compost pile in winter, you want to make sure that if your bulk of your compost pile is from leaves, you want to turn it in mid-November before it freezes. And then after that, you're not going to turn in winter because it allows heat to escape. And once again, your organisms that are in there breaking down that compost pile will be no more. So what you're going to do when it comes to cutting up materials that's easiest is to use some clippers. I like to use twigs because they do break down a lot faster. Also, generally, as long as they're dried out enough, you don't need to use clippers, and you just kind of throw them in there like that. Materials like this do tend, they're much more pliable, so I do use my clippers for those. I really don't worry about whether these are 1 inch long or not, because that is what most people say, but this stuff especially, it's so thin, it's going to break down either way. So it really doesn't matter to me or matter much at all. I've been making these for over 20 years. I've experimented different variety of ways, and I have found that you really don't have to complicate making compost piles. A lot of people do, and it's really a very easy process. As long as, like I said earlier, you're throwing in more brown than green, it's going to break down just fine. And what I am making here is a cool compost pile. I built this bin this year to keep it in place, and I'm going to be putting a gate in front of this, but I do have a container where I make a hot compost pile, and it's an old garbage can that I had drilled holes in the sides and in the bottom, and it has a lid that locks in place, and that one I use in spring through summer because it's going to break down well before fall, and then I'll be able to go ahead and add it to my garden. Compost actually makes a really good mulch for your garden, and so do mulched leaves. And so if you don't want to spend a bunch of money on mulch, which I don't, I actually use my mulched up leaves, and I put those on there because my yard has so many trees around it that I end up with a plethora of leaves that I cannot add to this because they get way too tall, way too fast. So it makes the perfect free mulch for my containers. And this compost pile, I actually just started this about 3 weeks ago. And because I use my mulching mower to pick up my leaves, it also cuts up grass blades. And so you can see this used to be about 4 feet tall. And in a matter of a few weeks, it is actually broken down to this much. And being that I live in the north, we don't have really warm temperatures up here right now because winter is on its way. I started this about the end of October, and you can see where it has made it to already. Thank you for joining me on Thriving Plants today. Please hit that like button down below so my video gets suggested more. And if you have any comments, please leave those below. I love hearing from you, and I'm going to see you on my next video. Thanks. Bye.